Welcome in to Kick in the Rear podcast, episode 17. My name is Joe Yarshin, and today we're going to be reviewing Pitch Anything by Oren Klaff. So this book is an innovative method for presenting, persuading, and winning the deal. I heard about this book on Bigger Pockets podcast originally, as I do a lot of books, but this book is awesome because Oren Klaff has unparalleled credentials. According to his book here, over the last 13 years, he's used his one-of-a-kind method to raise over $400 million. And basically how to use that winning pitch in any business situation. So without further ado, let's get into it. In chapter 1, he describes the big idea in 76 words. So I'm going to read this verbatim. There is a fundamental disconnect between the way we pitch anything and the way it is received by our audience. As a result, at the crucial moment when it is most important to be convincing, 9 out of 10 times we are not. Our most important messages have a surprisingly low chance of getting through. You need to understand why this disconnect occurs in order to overcome it, succeed, and profit. This book tells you how. So Oren has 8 chapters in the book. It's a quick read. It's a business book. It's applicable to entrepreneurship. It's applicable to real estate. It's applicable to your daily life. But essentially, each chapter goes into different pieces of the deal and pitching a deal. And in the first chapter, it's called The Method. He talks about pitching and what that means, needing a new method, dealing with the crocodile brain, which he simplifies as the croc brain. So appealing to the survivalistic part of the brain when you're talking to another person. You have to first get past that first layer and then get into what he calls the midbrain and then the neocortex, the logical reasoning part of the brain. And the reason why it's so important that all three parts of the brain play together is because when we are pitching something or trying to convince another person our plan, we skip right to the neocortex instead of disarming them first and getting past their primitive croc brain first. So in that first chapter, he dives deep into what that means. So we're hardwired to be bad at pitching. It's caused by the way our brains have evolved over the years. He discusses the croc brain at work. He says, as you're pitching your idea, the croc brain of the person sitting across from you isn't listening and thinking, is this a good idea or not? Its reaction to your pitch basically goes like this. Since this is not an emergency, how can I ignore this or spend the least amount of time on this as possible? So this filtering system of the crocodile brain has a very short-sighted view of the world. Anything that is not a crisis, it tries to mark as spam. So very important to get past that first part. He says that if you look at the Croc's brain filtering instructions, it looks like this. If it's not dangerous, ignore it. If it's not new and exciting, ignore it. If it is new, summarize it as quickly as possible and forget about the details. And finally, there's this specific instruction. Do not send anything up to the neocortex for problem solving unless you have a situation that is really unexpected and out of the ordinary. These are basic operating policies and procedures of our brains. No wonder pitching is so difficult. So again, going into the rules of engagement here, he says, did I get through? Was my message well received? He discusses that the croc brain is picky and a cognitive miser whose primary interest is survival. So it doesn't like to do a lot of work and is high maintenance when it is forced to perform. It requires concrete evidence presented simply in black and white to make a decision. Minor points of differentiation don't interest it. And this is why the brain to which you are pitching. So this is the brain to which you're pitching. So he discusses what the acronym STRONG stands for. So it's his pitch method to make it easy to remember. So you're going to set the frame, tell the story, reveal the intrigue, offer the prize, nail the hook point, and get the deal. In chapter 2, he discusses frame control, probably the most important part of the book. He reviews why frame control on the onset of a discussion pitch is critical to being taken seriously. He goes into the framework can be characterized many different ways, but there's an alpha and a beta in the conversation. And if you're a beta from the beginning, if you fall into a beta trap, you're not likely to deliver a successful pitch. So continuing on, owning the frame, win the game. He's got 5 steps here for doing so. So a frame is an instrument you use to package your power, authority, strength, information, and status. So these 5 points he says I'll share with you is: 1, everyone uses frames, whether they realize it or not. Every social encounter brings different frames together. Frames do not coexist in the same time and place for long. They crash into each other, and one or the other gains control. Only one frame survives. The others break and are absorbed. Stronger frames always absorb weaker frames. And finally, the winning frame governs the social interaction. It is said to have frame control. So this example he utilizes is great. He discusses what the COP frame is. So I'll go into that next. This example of the COP frame control and how it works is on page 25. And essentially it discusses how, if you get pulled over by a police officer or a dominant frame, basically you're going to be out of your frame control just from the onset of the interaction. And so when you're responding ineffectively to things the other person's saying and doing, he says that person owns the frame and you become frame controlled. So the lesson of the COP frame is an essential one. He says here that if you have to explain your authority, power, position, leverage, and advantage, you do not hold the stronger frame. So in a situation where you're getting pulled over, you're going to be out of the stronger frame control, and that person in the moral or higher authority is going to have the stronger frame. So he says that you have 3 major responses, frame types that you can use to meet oncoming frames, win the initial collision, and control the agenda. So he says first there's the power busting frame, time constraining frame, intrigue frame, and then the 4th one is the prize frame. So he discusses in the next chapter basically how you can recognize opposing frames and defeat them. So he first discusses the power frame. Most common opposing frame you encounter in a business setting is the power frame. So he discusses more about what some of those people look like: big shots, egomaniacs, things like that. And when you're encountering the frame, how to immediately counter it. So he says that when you abide by the rituals of power instead of establishing your own, you reinforce the opposing power frame. And then to instigate a power frame collision, use a mildly shocking but not unfriendly act to cause it. Use defiance and light humor. Captures the attention of the other person, elevates your status by creating something called local star power. Goes into local star power in chapter 3. So taking the frame, he says two things that come, 2 bullet points: perpetuate a small denial or act out some type of defiance. He gives additional examples. Next, on page 37, he discusses the prize frame and what that looks like, what it is, how to combat it. He gives prizing 101 example here. So a critical piece of that frame is presenting an idea that looks attractive. So keep on going through this chapter here. Page 49, he discusses what the time frame is. So he says frames involving time tend to occur later in the social exchange. So after someone has already established frame control, again, if you want to know who has the frame, it's easy to observe. But he says when you are reacting to the other person, that person owns the frame. When the other person is reacting to what you do and say, you own the frame. He says instead, when you see attention begin to bottom out and expire, that's it, you're done. So stay in control of time, start wrapping up. Running long or beyond the point of attention shows weakness, neediness, and desperation. So a lot of really great back and forth examples here on page 50 and 51. Another frame that you'll encounter is called the analyst frame. Like the time frame, the analyst frame appears after the initial frame collision, can derail you just when you're about to reach a decision. So he says it's a deadly frame that you must know how to repel using the intrigue frame, which he then goes on to discuss more in detail on page 52. So I like this intrigue frame because it's a good counter, again, to the analyst. And then the intrigue story, he says, needs to follow 6 elements. It's got to be brief. The subject must be relevant to your pitch. 2, you need to be at the center of the story. 3, there should be risk, danger, uncertainty. 4, should be time pressure. A clock is ticking somewhere. 5, there should be tension. And 6, there should be serious consequences. Failure will not be pretty. So he goes into his intrigue story. And this is where the book starts to really pick up speed a little bit. And he starts giving some personal examples of deals he's put together that the stakes are really high. And I really started to read this faster pace once we got to this step, because then you get toward the end of the book and just like I couldn't put it down. It just got super interesting. So stopping the analyst frame, breaking the analyst frame with suspense. He goes back into the pricing frame again and why it's important. He says successful pricing restores calm and poise to the social interaction. So I like that a lot. Talks about some of the basics here with the prize. If you're trying to win your target's respect, attention, and money, he becomes the prize. When your target is trying to win your attention and respect, you are the prize. This is, of course, what you want. So pricing is essentially, says, the sum of the actions you take to get your target to understand that he's a commodity and you are the prize. Successful pricing results in your target chasing you, asking to be involved in your deal. And then pricing, why it works, avoiding mistakes. He says there's 2 basic ideas: make the buyer qualify himself back to you, protect your status. Additional steps, he goes into that in the pricing example. Chapter 3 discusses status, why status is so important. He talks about a practical example of how he went to a very high-end restaurant with some of his colleagues, and he was going to be buying the meal, and there's this French waiter that really just put him in his place, because from the onset of the interaction, the French waiter was able to control the frame, control the interactions, and make him look like a passenger on his restaurant ride. So essentially, controlling the frame in this example he talks about just set him up for failure. So that was a really good story on that page on 73. And then he talks about the alpha and beta status positions. So being a higher status person puts you in the alpha position, and then falling into the lower status position puts you in the beta position. He discusses what beta traps are. And I like this part because it talks about something, you might encounter every day. An example would be a lobby. So when you go into a waiting room or a lobby, that's set up for you to be the person to react to the situation. And so he talks about why that's important. And then finishing up, he talks about elevating your social status in that chapter. He gives this really cool story about a hedge fund manager. And then he reviews all the breakpoints of that story and how it led to the deal getting closed. And then he discusses seizing situational status. So sometimes ignoring power rituals, avoiding these beta traps, you can be unaffected by your customer's global status. He says to look for opportunities to perpetrate small denials. Again, taking the power quickly, moving the discussion into an area where you're the expert of the conversation, applying the prize frame by positioning yourself as the reward, and then confirming your alpha status by making your customer in the beta position make a statement that qualifies your higher status. So like, why would you want to work with me? After you've already shown them the value, makes them kind of prove it to you. So then chapter 4, pitching your big idea. He says, pause and consider this for a moment. The most important scientific discovery of the 20th century can be pitched in 5 minutes. He discusses in 1953, the molecular biologist James Watson, Francis Crick, how they pitched their idea for the double helix DNA structure. So really cool Nobel Prize winning speech and pitch. So in pitching the big idea, he talks about 4 sections or phases. So he says the first phase, introduce yourself and the big idea. This takes about 5 minutes. He says in the second step, you want to explain the budget and your secret sauce, he calls it, in 10 minutes. And then in step 3, offer the deal in about 2 minutes, and then stacking frames for hot cognition in 3 minutes. So all in all, this should take about 20 minutes. And then he goes into each of these phases. So phase 1, introduce yourself and the big idea. And then the why now frame he talks about, which is really cool. It's vitally important that the target knows that your idea is new, emerging from current market opportunities. So he says you can leverage that further by talking about 3 market forces pattern, trend casting. So economic forces is the first, social forces second, and technology forces 3. So when you're talking about any given idea, if you're bringing up 3 different market conditions, it's going to make you the expert in the conversation. I think realtors do this often in my conversations with them in investment real estate. So I think this is a cool idea that broke it down in a real example. And when I saw it happening in real life, it just gave me an aha moment. So really like that part. Introducing the big idea, gives several examples how to do that. And then finishing up, that's the phase 1. Phase 2, explaining the budget and the secret sauce. He talks about how to get their attention and what is attention. And this was really cool. So he says, to control attention, I've always felt it's important to know what it's made of. He talks about dopamine is the neurotransmitter of desire. Norepinephrine is a neurotransmitter of tension. So he says together they add up to attention. So desire and tension is attention. He talks about what dopamine does, how it leads to feeling of novelty. Talks about tension. Tension indicates consequences and importance. And then high intensity push-pull pattern. This was probably the epitome of using these concepts together of dopamine and norepinephrine. And then he talks about what the heart of the pitch looks like, pitching numbers and projections, how competition and secret sauce come into it. Phase 3 is offering the deal. So finishing up that chapter, going into chapter 5, he talks about frame stacking and hot cognitions. This is, again, where the book really picks up with some of his examples, what these look like, how the frame stacking works, and then how your analytical and brain works. It's just really, really awesome how he gives the real examples of how to do this in a pitch. So hot cognition 1, the intrigue frame; 2, the prize frame; 3, the time frame; and 4, the moral authority frame. He talks about each of those and examples. And then getting into the end of that chapter, putting it all together, he says reality is waiting to be framed, hot versus cold cognition. So he says hot cognitions are primal versus and also that hot cognitions are unavoidable, and that they tend to be instant and enduring. Chapter 6, getting toward the end of the book again, eradicating neediness. So I think anytime I've ever asked for something or like pitched something, I think it's human nature to come from a point of neediness. So if you can avoid being or coming across as needy, it's way more effective in delivering what you're asking for or pitching. And so 4 pitches, he talks about the mistakes he made and how they were handled. So he says the importance of eradicating neediness, what causes neediness, and counteracting validation-seeking behavior. So if you act like you want nothing, focus on only things you do well, and you announce your intention to leave the social encounter, can be very effective combination of behaviors. And then he discusses the final pitch. the final pitch is just the ultimate part of the book here. It gets really great. Then he talks about the case study in the airport deal he did, which led to the biggest deal at the end of the book, which I won't spoil, but he talked about how much preparation and how many months of prep went into this pitch, but actually delivering the pitch is only 20 minutes or so. And in the end of the book, he's having to pitch in front of other teams that are also pitching, so it just adds to the stakes. And then overall, I would say this book was just great. If you're a business entrepreneur, if you're a real estate investor, I think it's going to help. It's going to help you in your negotiations, just like Chris Voss's book, Never Split the Difference. It talks about a lot of the same human elements, and it just brings it together in a way that's a little bit different than Chris Voss's method. So, and how you're persuading and presenting and winning the deal is all about the book. And I think Oren Klaff does a great job presenting it. Ironically, pitching a book about pitching is kind of funny to me, but I mean, he does a great job. Again, him and David Green discussed it at length on the podcast, and I just like what he's doing. I think he is doing it the right way, making it easy for the average person to implement these things. So if you like today's episode, please like and subscribe and share it with anyone that you know that likes business books, real estate investing. I'm going to be continuing on my journey of real estate investing, and I'm trying to close in on my second deal of the year here, my third property. So hopefully more information and details to come on that next time I present. So bippity boppity investment property. Let's go.